What's going on, everybody? Justin Thomas here. If you have not subscribed, make sure to do so now and hit that notification bell so you get updates every time I upload. When people talk about A Song of Ice and Fire and what makes it different are, in some people's opinions, better than the works of Tolkien and other popular high fantasy works, the discussion is almost always going to be discussing tropes, how he deconstructs them, how he subverts expectations that are set by your classic high fantasy. But in most cases, this all circles back, and what George is always relating his works to is the work of Tolkien, specifically his highly popular high fantasy epic, The Lord of the Rings trilogy. Actually, one of the main points discussed and disputed is the deconstruction of the classic high fantasy tropes. So what are tropes, and how does George R.R. Martin deconstruct them? And let's go even a step further and ask, does he actually deconstruct all these classic fantasy tropes, or as some would say, cliches? As it's clear from many statements made by George that he has set out to turn these classic fantasy tropes on their heads, specifically the ones established by Tolkien. So let's start with the basics. What is a trope? What are some commonly used tropes in high fantasy as well as other popular genres? And how tropes are not totally discarded per se, but are simply subverted in not only George's work but many other popular shows and films that are most likely being watched by many of those that are fans of Game of Thrones. Subverting tropes simply subvert expectations, and the subversion of expectations is the key to good entertainment. So a trope is a conceptual figure of speech, a storytelling shorthand for a concept that the audience will recognize and understand instantly. Above all, a trope is a convention. It can be used as a plot trick, a setup, a narrative structure, a character type, a linguistic idiom, a visual aesthetic, etc., etc. So you might hear some people say stories were way more original back in the day. Everything now is just a bunch of recycled garbage and cliches. Now, as far as storytelling goes, I think the last original story was probably written on a cave wall. We've been adapting these stories ever since. That's why tropes are so prevalent in storytelling. Tropes help a story move. They're present in every aspect of the story. Yes, you could argue some tropes are overused, but that's all very subjective. Tropes are 100% necessary if you want to tell a story. Even if you found a way to tell a story without a single trope, which again is impossible, it would technically become a trope itself and be known as a tropeless story trope. So a quick example of a visual aesthetic trope is the icy blue eye trope. Now this one is used in a lot of the series that I cover on this channel. The icy blue eyes are used in not only Game of Thrones with Roose Bolton, but also the occult blue eyes, which are just a shade of a darker blue eye, are used for the White Walkers in Game of Thrones. The use of the icy blue eye trope, for example, with Roose Bolton, gives a keen audience member the feeling that this character is cold and calculating. When we're reading or watching a series, when we see somebody with these cold, icy blue eyes, it has a psychological effect on most readers or viewers, telling us that this character is cold-hearted and calculating. It's embedded in our subconscious, and a skilled writer will always utilize these tropes. Now, the occult blue eyes, which you see in the White Walkers, are used to show that the character, monster, so on, is a magical being, supernatural. A lot of times you will see the transformation from the regular pigment of the eye to the occult blue eyes to symbolize the supernatural aspect. A great example of this is seen in Game of Thrones when the Night King is turning one of Craster's babies into a White Walker. In recent years, there are many examples in popular television series and films in which this trope can be seen. The occult blue eyes are prevalent in the show Supernatural, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and the doppelgangers from Twin Peaks also have the occult eyes. As for icy blue eyes, they're also very prevalent in many of the popular television shows in recent years. The icy blue eyes are prevalent in Vikings with Ragnar Lothbrok and now his son, Ivar the Boneless, showing a cold and calculating mannerism. Also in Peaky Blinders, it's utilized with the character played by Cillian Murphy, Thomas Shelby, showing that he is a cold and calculating figure. You'll notice when Cillian is making a decision that could be considered unethical or immoral, putting somebody in danger or a life on the line or taking a life, that they will focus more on Cillian's eyes. A simple example of this type of trope being used to move a story along without having to waste time with exposition is having an evil character, say with a eye patch or cape. In most cases, you will look at a character on first sight that would have a eye patch and cape and assume they're evil. They don't need to give a backstory, you just know that they're up to no good. Again, this is far less subtle and far less original, most likely be deemed by most a cliche, again subjective and a matter of opinion. But nonetheless, it's just a simpler version of utilizing the cold blue eyes or occult blue eyes. Now, of course, tropes go much further than anything aesthetic. They go with character archetypes, they go with overall storyline of a series, film, or book. Is also always a trope of some sort, a hero's journey, rags to riches, so on. So what is subverting a trope? It's basically playing bait and switch with a trope. It's when a work makes you think a trope is going to happen, but it doesn't. The tropes live in the minds of the audience, whether they realize it or not. Especially within trope-savvy audience members, we can predict a familiar trope coming based on its hints dropped by the writer. This is one of the reasons the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones was so successful, since most figured Robb was the hero of the story, so when he dies at the Red Wedding, the hero's journey is subverted. A good writer hints at the trope, build the expectation for a certain trope such as the hero's journey, only to reveal that the expected trope was a red herring. An example that's commonly used for a subverted trope is simply a car chase in progress at reckless speeds. The camera cuts to some workers carrying a sheet of glass and then cuts back to the panicked driver headed towards the workers. It seems pretty obvious that the driver's going to smash through the glass sheet, so if the car drives through the pane of glass, it's played straight. If the car drives through the pane of glass and the driver stops to explain the reason he crashed into it, it's justified. If the car misses the pane of glass, it's subverted. If something else happens to cause the glass to be broken before the car can even make it to where the glass is, it is also subverted. Another subversion if the car hits the glass but is simply knocked out of the worker's hands, neither the glass nor the car is broken. There's also examples of double subversion, and it goes on and on. For this video, we will stick onto subversion. But as you can see, a writer has a lot of different options, and these little subtle changes make a huge difference in the overall scheme of things. So now that we've established what tropes are, let's look at tropes both subverted and straight played within the Game of Thrones in A Song of Ice and Fire. So George is mostly known for subverting expectations of the status quo of popular high fantasy. He has stated time and time again that one of the main driving points when he was first writing A Song of Ice and Fire was that he was sick of all the bloodless battles in Lord of the Rings and the one-dimensional characters and storylines throughout all high fantasy stories, such as evil orcs who are pure evil for no apparent reason other than their story needs a villain, and the ugly orcs are that villain. And that the heroes are your handsome men and beautiful creatures who follow your classic hero's journey. He set out to defy what he saw as cliches of popular fantasy, and in many ways he does. He subverts the hero's journey by killing multiple lead characters who are indeed on what appears to just be your typical hero's journey until they are one head shorter. And they aren't always being slayed by the enemy. The heroes are often betrayed by their own allies, although in many cases, such as the Red Wedding, we have many reasons to believe Walder Frey is not to be trusted, and to some extent the same can be said for the Boltons. George writes complex characters and it works, but there are times he definitely sticks to the tropes of typical high fantasy. Jon's story so far is the best example of that. Now, this is a far too complex topic to cover in one video. Now that we've established what tropes are and how tropes are subverted, let's take a look at some of the main tropes played straight and those that are subverted, meaning which tropes has George successfully deconstructed and which are being played straight. In the next video, we'll dive a little bit deeper into how the way that he has played these tropes affects the story so far and what this can tell us about what's in store for the story and how the story will end. So first, let's start off with the classic tropes that George has played straight. One of the most important tropes and character archetypes in the story so far, and especially for the story if George does plan on subverting, deconstructing this typical hero's arc, is Jon. Like we just went over, Jon is one of the straightest examples of a hero in both book and show. Now there are many forms of a hero that storytellers utilize. Jon hits on almost all of them. First, we have the ace. The ace is someone who is ridiculously good at what they do, whatever that happens to be, and everyone knows it. People look up to them, envy them, and are in awe of them. He or she has a reputation for doing the impossible, and may be shrouded in myth, as people are unable to separate their real accomplishments from unfounded rumors. In a work revolving around a specific activity, any kind of serious business, the ace will be the best at it. Other characters may refer to the ace as the best of the best at this activity. In works lacking that sort of focus, they'll probably be extremely talented at everything. Jon immediately becomes the ace to his fellow recruits and his best friend Sam, and after the Battle of Castle Black, where he was one of the main defenders alongside Sir Alistair, Pip, Gren, and Dolorous Ed, he becomes this to most of the Night's Watch. Despite his youth, by Season 6, his exploits are so well known throughout all of Westeros that even someone as overconfident and as dangerous as Ramsay Bolton considers him to be the greatest swordsman in the North by reputation alone. Other potential aces in A Song of Ice and Fire are Jaime Lannister, Tywin Lannister, Robb Stark, Syrio Forel, and Bronn. Jon is a talented swordsman and a good fighter in the novels. He's an embodiment of your ass-kicking hero. He's a veritable one-man army, who amongst his other impressive feats killed a White Walker general in single combat. This makes him a living legend, adding on yet another hero archetype. He has 53 on-screen kills to his credit by the end of Season 6, 23 alone in the Battle of the Bastards. We could literally go on for another hour with all the stereotypical hero qualities that Jon's character contains. Throughout his arc, he serves as the apprentice to Jorah Mormont in the Night's Watch. He also has the stereotypical arch-enemy with the Night King. He also fulfills the trope known as the Big Good. Jon becomes one of these, particularly from Season 5 onward. Later, he is the indisputable leader of the living and is named King of the North after convincing the northern houses of the true enemy to come in the winter storms. The Big Good is the cornerstone of any heroic organization. This character is explicitly stated to be the counterpart to combat the forces of evil, likely calling all the shots, and is normally the highest ranking or the absolute most powerful, since the hero is usually, but not always, synonymous with the protagonist. So what does this all tell us? Well, if you look especially at the last one, the Big Good, it does look like Jon is going to be the one to be sacrificed again. But yet this is still this trope being played straight. There's no subversion here. When it comes down to it, the Big Good, or even the hero of the story, doesn't always mean that they're the main protagonist. George always leans more towards a rigid storyline rather than giving us one fluent narrative of one protagonist and one antagonist. Simply put, Jon could continue to serve as the Big Good, the ultimate hero, and end up dying once more, even though he's already fulfilled all of the tropes that go along with this arc before. The Chosen One, the Resurrected, and so on, meaning we could see Jon make one more sacrifice before the story concludes. George has kind of sped up this arc with having his resurrection come earlier on in the story than it usually would in a traditional hero's journey. He simply just might repeat the process once more. It seems as though Jon will continue to be the number one force of good in this world, but most likely at the very least will not end up on top in the end. With all this being said, we have to wonder, with all the comparisons to Lord of the Rings, and all the statements George has made about wanting to subvert as many tropes as possible, why this major one is played so straight. Now we could go even further and go into the much discussed topic of how similar Jon is to the Lord of the Rings hero Aragorn, but I will list in the information below a multitude of videos that cover this topic. Let's just say the main hero of Lord of the Rings and the main hero of A Song of Ice and Fire, at least to this point, are almost exactly identical in every way. The only exception being Jon may be the clearest candidate for the main hero right now, but is in no way the only candidate. So what do we say to George's statements about deconstructing all the high fantasy tropes, and those who lay the heavy claim that A Song of Ice and Fire subverts every single cliche of Lord of the Rings? Well, that's simply not true. Jon is a clear case of it here, and we haven't even got into the other hero candidates. I think a big difference here is there is multiple examples of this straight played trope instead of just one single one, which makes it a far more rigid and unpredictable storyline. But again, this is just one of these straight played tropes. It just happens to be one of the tropes that plays the largest role in the outcome of the story. There are plenty of subverted, deconstructed tropes that we will get to in this episode, and even more in episodes to come. Now, it's important to remember that even though George has been very vocal about wanting to deconstruct and subvert all the high fantasy tropes and cliches set by Lord of the Rings, but mainly the bloodless battles or the simply good or evil characters, he has stated many times that the ending of A Song of Ice and Fire will be very similar to Lord of the Rings, something to keep in mind when we discuss the rest of these tropes. So let's go over one of the major subverted tropes of Game of Thrones. This is known as Machiavelli was wrong. Of course, the overall theme of Machiavelli's The Prince is what they're referring to, where it is said to be better to be feared than loved. So if you're thinking, well, that sounds about right for Game of Thrones, that's pretty much how anybody that's been successful so far, with the exception of Jon, has had to rule. Well, the classic fantasy trope will usually go against this and say it's better to be loved. Worlds that operate on this philosophy often see fear-using villains fail to inspire any loyalty in their subject, or at the very least inspire inept loyalty because of fear is not a good motivating force. Bands of heroes are generally held together by the power of friendship. love, or just general loyalty to the hero. Indeed, the leader who acts as a father to his men gains more loyalty from them than one who acts as a tyrant. Bands of villains tend to be held together by fear of the head villain. Eventually, villains often discover, to their surprise, that while fear might be easier to establish, love has a lot more staying power. Here's a quick quote from Niccolo Machiavelli's infamous The Prince. Whether it be better to be loved than feared, or feared than loved, it may be answered that one should wish to be both, but because it's difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved when the two either must be dispensed with. Nevertheless, a prince ought to inspire fear in such a way that if he does not win love, he avoids hatred. He can endure very well being feared, whilst he is not hated. People and fictional villains often forget the important thing Machiavelli pointed out, however. It is preferable to be feared and loved, choosing fear only in love when you can't have both, and in any event, is vital to avoid being hated, since if you are hated, people will be willing to suffer just to oppose you. Best of all is to command obedience through respect. In essence, it'd be more true to form to say Machiavelli was right, if not for this popular misunderstanding. It's also worth noting that some scholars and people like myself think the prince was a satire of dictatorship, since everything else he wrote directly contradicts the prince. In other words, Machiavelli was joking. The misunderstandings are due to the early English translations, which were blind, idiot translations that turned the line, "Look to the consequences before you act," into the ends justify the means. But obviously using the base idea that all those who try to rule like a father or any type of loving compassion, Renly does this. The Starks obviously are a good example of this. And like I said, until Jon, none have been successful. And even Jon was killed. Only magic brings Jon back. So this subverts this trope totally. You don't have your merry band of fellows running around in Game of Thrones achieving much. It's usually ending bad for them, as of right now in the story. Even the Brotherhood without banners are not exactly your merry band of fellows running around like you will see in traditional high fantasy. They're essentially robbing and stealing from people. Yes, overall they're good, but just like everything in Game of Thrones, they are gray. So the Machiavelli was wrong trope is totally subverted in Game of Thrones without a question. Another high fantasy trope that Game of Thrones in A Song of Ice and Fire successfully subverts is the magic comes back. Most fantasy portrays the return of magic as a return of a golden age. In Game of Thrones, though, it makes a bad situation worse because of the loss of knowledge over time. Very few people can understand, control, or protect against this powerful and, in many cases, dangerous force. Most people don't even believe in the magic, making them terribly unprepared for what's to come. Instead of stories like Lord of the Rings, where you have magic being a saving force of a realm, it is a destructive power that is capable of bringing upon Armageddon to Westeros and the Planetos as a whole. Our next one is beauty is never tarnished. This trope is both played straight and subverted in Game of Thrones. Predominantly seen in female characters, but is not limited to female heroes or characters who, just like male characters, get into dangerous situations, even get into fights, but where death-defying stunts leave men visibly bruised and bloody. The women are oddly put together while women tear their clothing. It is a kind of clothing damage. If their hair and makeup is unkept, it's artfully disheveled. Basically, fierce hand-to-hand fights are cool, even sexy, but the broken nose and black eyes are not present within the content. A heroine will almost always never suffer a permanent injury, such as a loss of a limb, eye, no matter how much punishment she goes through. Though even when the heroine dies, they'll usually be privileged to suffer a beautiful death. The other concerns a different form of beauty, inner beauty, the recognition that women have bodily functions due to being, human gross out jokes, and anything involving farts, burps, or whatever are male territory only. Like I said, Game of Thrones both subverts and follows this trope. They subvert it with Jon, who does gain scars throughout the seasons, as we see, and also in the books. And also, it definitely in the books only, it subverts the inner beauty aspect of this, with Dany spending a whole chapter, a whole POV with dysentery and just terrible diarrhea. I don't blame them for not putting that in the show, but that definitely subverts. This is a great example of George purposely going out and subverting that trope by literally having Dany spend a whole POV with just terrible, awful diarrhea. And people that might not have read the books don't believe that that's a thing, but we'll link the chapters below. So your examples of this being followed straight and other stories are, of course, in Lord of the Rings. Legolas doesn't really ever have any damage done to his pretty boy face. And Princess Leia in Star Wars, when she's captured, she looks more glamorous than ever. But this is still prevalent in Game of Thrones with Sansa and even Arya. They do put a little bit of mud on Arya's face, but let's face it, the Bravo Sea incident and actions would lead to her being not only just dead, but at the very least pretty disfigured. So they do subvert this, but they also follow this. So we will end off with one of the straight played tropes that is going to lead into our next episode, and it's going to be discussing why it's important to play some tropes straight in order to set expectations, in order to achieve subverting them, and also why you can't just change everything in an effort to just simply be different, and how George strategically seems to be playing some tropes straight when subverting others. This one is Bronn, who is definitely your lovable rogue. He is your stereotypical prototype to a T lovable rogue. Lovable rogue is a click above the lovable traitor, who is definitely not a nice person, but wins by lowering the audience's expectations so much that he charms them with a few token pet the dog moments, which usually include helping the hero. It's amazing how much fans overlook if they help the hero. Usually male but female thieves tend to be considered lovable rogues by default. Now, pet the dog, and I will put up the definition for the kick the dog, is simple moments that are put in for the sake of just making the audience like somebody or hate somebody. It doesn't further the story in any way or do any type of development to the character other than literally manipulate the audience for the sake of manipulation. As we see with Bronn when we first meet him, we find that he's killed women, he's killed children, and he has no qualms about it. But as we get to know him, just like with all George's characters, he's complex, and he's a great character to play off both Tyrion and Jaime, and a great example of George playing a character straight when it's necessary. There's a lot of theories out there about Bronn being a secret traitor or working for who. That's a great example of why people's expectations are subverted when it's not even being subverted. We are so used to George going against the grain that when he does, it almost creates a subversion by playing it straight. I'm Justin Thomas. I hope you found that interesting. We'll be coming out with some more later this week in a Westworld video on Thursday. Make sure to like and subscribe and check out my Patreon page to support creativity and help the channel grow. No, I didn't see you guys there. I'm Justin Thomas, and I hope you enjoyed that video. And if you did enjoy that video, make sure to check out some of our other videos, maybe right here, possibly right there, but make sure to subscribe right there. And we'll see you guys soon.